Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream by podcast. Tonight, I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes, and tonight we're going to be talking about the reasons why the consensus of scholars overwhelmingly believe that the Gospel of Mark is the first of the four biblical Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke and John copy the Gospel of Mark. Now, granted, the John part is a little more controversial because some scholars still believe that John is independent of Mark, but there are others that believe it knew Mark. So with that being said, thank you for joining me tonight, Frank.
It's my pleasure.
And let's get right into the slides. So tell us a bit about the earlier debates about Markan priority.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. And I do have kind of an introductory thing in case everybody's not familiar with some of our terminology. Well, the Gospels needed to have been written for some reason or reasons. And so early Christian congregations, starting shortly after the death and resurrection, as I believe, of Christ, taught and they told what Jesus said and did. And it was remembered by the apostles. I mean, the apostles were present. The original 12 apostles, minus Judas, were present during the lifetime of the historical Jesus. And also others were present. And so if anyone wanted to know, if anyone had any doubts about what Jesus said and what Jesus did, they could obviously ask the people that saw it and heard it. And the apostles were all martyred, with the notable exception of the apostle John. He was known as John the Elder, and he seems to have gone to Ephesus in Asia Minor. And he lived to a ripe, indeed maybe rotten old age. There was a story about in his old age and his feebleness, he had to be carried to church. And when he got to church, all he could say was, "Little children love one another." And I think the comment is, well, if we would do that, that would be a lot, right? So there is the story of the elder John living to a ripe, indeed, probably rotten old age. And of course, there is the story of St. John and the robber that is preserved in Clement of Alexandria's work, Sermon on Which Rich Man is Being Saved. The oral stories and narratives were already in circulation. They were already in circulation. And at some point, they made the jump between the language of Jesus and his original apostles. And the jump was from that dialect of Aramaic to Greek. And eventually, these stories got written down, probably not all at once. But these stories eventually became the Gospels that we know. And so the so-called evangelists, were not only writers, but they were also compilers and editors. So let's go to the next. We know the term Synoptic Gospels, and that means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Synoptic means, syn means with or together with, and optimi means to view. And so since Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so much closer to each other, and they are so different than the Gospel of John. There are massive differences between the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John. Very notably, how many times did the adult Jesus go to Jerusalem? And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only once. And in John, unless you rearrange the Gospel of John, the adult Jesus went to Jerusalem 3 times. So that's a big difference. And there are others. So let's go to the next. And now biblical studies as we know it it's a child of the Enlightenment. And in the Enlightenment, scholars in Europe, particularly Western Europe, decided that instead of just saying, okay, whatever the church says, that's wonderful, they essentially said, when you make truth claims about Jesus and when you make historical claims about Jesus, this is susceptible to being investigated historically. And starting in the late 18th century, Hermann Samuel Reimarus had doubts about the historicity of the teachings of Jesus as presented in the Gospels. He had very heretical thoughts, and he didn't think that he would get away with publishing it during his lifetime. So he had the Wolfenbüttel fragments published after his death. And Albert Schweitzer's book was called originally Von Reimarus zu Wrede. And so his masterpiece, written in about 1906 in the first edition, chronicles in great detail the research and writings by gospel scholars dealing with the sources that were closest to the historical Jesus, and just the whole question of what can you know about the historical Jesus. It began with Reimarus, and then it took place through all of the 20th century, and it went into all through the 19th century, and then went into the 20th century with the people after Wrede. And then other people, such as Ernst Käsemann, my teacher's teacher, wrote about a second quest of the historical Jesus. And then there was a third quest. And now there is a new quest of the historical Jesus that a lot of people are getting very very, very interested in. But let's go on to the next. The basic assumption of Life of Jesus research was that since Jesus died in about 30 or 33 CE, and I believe that 33 is a little bit more likely than 30 CE, the idea is the sources that are closer in time to Jesus himself are very likely to give more accurate information about Jesus and sayings from Jesus than sources that are 50 to 100 years or 500 years later than the death of Jesus. In other words, earlier sources are closer to what Jesus of Nazareth said and did during his lifetime by comparison with later sources. And so Markan priority is the question of which gospel is first was a subset of the larger Life of Jesus movement. And so Markan priority was not actually first proposed, but it was worked out for the first time by Christian Hermann Weisse and Christian Gottlob Wilke, independently of each other, ironically the same year, 1838. Now let's go on to the next. Well, the idea, of course, has to do with how do you get closer and closer to Jesus, right, historically? And so the problem is that people also got interested in reading the Greek text. And the Greek text is the only text of the New Testament. And so when the Gospels were the Bible was translated into English, or the New Testament was translated into English, they didn't have extremely early manuscripts. Many of their manuscripts were from the 10th century CE and later. And then, ironically, in the 19th century, in about the mid-19th century or early 19th century, scholars began to discover earlier manuscripts of the New Testament. And so we give them capital letters, and these are manuscripts that are written in all capital letters, and therefore we call them majuscules or uncials. And so capital A is Codex Alexandrinus. It was written in the 5th century. It's in the British Museum. Codex Vaticanus is B, and it is one of the chief treasures, if not the chief treasure, of the Vatican Library. And then, since A was already taken, Constantine von Tischendorf was looking at manuscripts at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, and he found one that was the whole Bible, and it was written in all capital letters. And so we give the symbol Aleph to it. You know, A was already taken, so we gave it Aleph, and that's called Codex Sinaiticus because it was in St. Catherine's Monastery at the top of Mount Sinai. And these three manuscripts from the 4th and 5th centuries dominate the revised version of 1881, which was an approved revision of the King James Version, which British people call the Authorized Version. And then Westcott and Hort, two Cambridge scholars, brought out an edition of the Greek New Testament, drawing very heavily on these three uncials, and they brought that out in the same year. And even though there are many, many, many more numerous later manuscripts, the theory that they use is that even though they are far fewer, the three big uncial manuscripts, their importance outweighs the readings of the later manuscripts, even though the earlier manuscripts are far fewer. So let's go on to the next. And so Markan priority is the scholarly understanding that Mark was a written source for Matthew and Luke. And so this hypothesis holds that the reason that there is so much similarity among Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and Luke get the basic framework and a great deal of other material from for their gospels from the Gospel of Mark. And I certainly believe that more than 90% of New Testament scholars hold the hypothesis of Markan priority as most likely, more likely than Matthean priority. I've never taken a poll on that, but that's the way that most of us were taught. And that's the way that I was taught, and that's the way I taught. Let's go to the next. In the early church, there was oral tradition. And so in the middle to late 1st century, oral tradition was going around because before there was a New Testament, there were churches and there were apostles and there were bishops and presbyters and deacons before there was ever a canon of the New Testament. And so these sayings were being passed around very freely, and there were local variations. And so it's reasonable that oral tradition would have been quite different in different cities, different regions, and at different times. So let's go to the next. And so then you see, in my view, oral traditions affected Mark and Q, but also oral tradition affected Matthew and Luke. And so even though Matthew and Luke were written down and they used as their sources Mark and Q, oral traditions still affected Matthew and Luke as well as Mark and Q, even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke were already in written form, and Q was probably in written form, I guess. And so the oral tradition didn't die just because the written gospels were available. So let's go to the next. And oral tradition started immediately after the resurrection in about 33 CE. And so this oral tradition that we find so much of in the Gospels was not available to Paul, and therefore we don't see any of it in Paul. And then there were other sayings that floated around, like in Acts. Remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how he said, "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Well, that's not in the Gospels anywhere, but it's preserved in Acts. So the oral tradition that you see in the Gospels is not in Paul. It's not that Paul was necessarily apprehensive of it or didn't like it. I mean, that's possible, but there's just no evidence that Paul had access to it. And so the apostle was doing his thing and the other apostles were doing their thing. And then as time went on in the 1st century, the apostles started dying, human life being what it is. And so a major impetus for the collection and compilation of oral tradition into the Gospels was probably the death of the apostles, as well as Jesus prophesied the second coming to be really soon. And Paul believed that too. But the second coming kept on not coming. And so the death of the apostles and the second coming not coming meant that there needed to be a written source for the teachings of Jesus. And that's what the Gospels were. So let's go to the next. And therefore, the New Testament is, if you believe that Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, is a collection of 8 letters and letter fragments, like I do, then that means the New Testament is a collection of collections of collections of early Christian writings. The earliest collection is, well, the Corinthian correspondence being edited into 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then the next collection is the Pauline corpus, including the Corinthian correspondence. And then the Gospels is the next collection. And then the next collection included the general letters, or the Catholic epistles, as they're called, because they're not written to any one single congregation, as Paul's letters were. And so that includes James, 1st, 2nd Peter, Jude, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Those 7 are called the Catholic epistles. In the manuscript tradition, the book of Acts and the Catholic tradition and the Catholic epistles were transmitted together. And then the Revelation to John has its own manuscript tradition. And of course, it is the most unlike any other New Testament writing. So let's go on. And so this is a timeline, and you've seen this timeline before. I don't date John. I don't date Mark before 70. And then if you believe in Markan priority, then you have to date Matthew and Luke after Mark. The same would be true of John. I'm not convinced that John was even written in the 1st century, so who knows? So let's go on. We know that the Gospels are of different length. Mark is the shortest, and Luke is the longest, actually the longest book in the New Testament. So let's go on to the next. And you can see that this is the commonly accepted solution to the synoptic problem. Now, I admit B.H. Streeter in 1924 added, a source of Matthean sayings that was not Mark and not Q, and he called it M. And then the other pre-Lucan source was called L, and then he also believed in Proto-Luke. And those are very unnecessary bells and whistles, I would say. So basically, this theory that you see on the screen is called the two-source theory, or the two-source theory. The two sources are Mark and Q. So let's go on.
I'll show everybody real quick what Streeter's diagram looks like so they can understand the differences.
Right. Yeah, you have the Streeter. If you can't find it,
I'm gonna put the book up. I found it. I'm gonna put the book up on the screen.
Right. Yeah, he has more bells and whistles, but you can see Mark is first, and then Mark is a source for Matthew and Luke, and then he has his theories about Q and M and L, et cetera, et cetera. So those are other bells and whistles, but there are many other pictures of the synoptic theories, but Streeter's is very famous, and rightly so. So anyway, this is called the two-source theory. Let's go on. Markan priority is the theory that of the 3 synoptic gospels, Mark is the earliest, and Mark was the major source for Matthew and Luke. And so if Markan priority is correct, Mark was also the skeleton of Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke add, quite independently of each other, resurrection appearances at the end, after the empty tomb story, and the Annunciation and infancy narratives at the beginning. And so the resurrection stories in Matthew and Luke are not the same. And so we know, therefore, that they did not get it from a different edition of Mark. And the Annunciation and infancy narratives are quite different in Matthew and Luke. I mean, with Matthew, you've got the angels and the shepherds, and with with Luke, you've got the angels and the shepherds, and with Matthew, you've got the magicians, the pagan magicians, magi, and the flight to Egypt. So they are very different from each other at that point. But in most of Matthew and Luke, they're the same. And the reason they're the same is they get it from Mark. They get the skeleton from Mark, and then they add more teaching material, which is mostly sayings material, from Q, if the Q hypothesis is correct. So let's go on. Not everybody agrees. Before 1838, there were some suggestions by a fellow named Owen, and then there was a fellow named J.J. Griesbach that believed that Matthew was first. And of course, that was the tradition of the church. There are fragments of this fellow named Papias, who is supposed to have been a disciple of the Apostle John, quoted by Irenaeus in the 180s and by Eusebius in the early 4th century, that said that the Gospel of Matthew was first and that it was in Hebrew. But let's go on. There were many important voices in the debate, and the debate still goes on. Johann Jakob Griesbach made the first synopsis of the Synoptic Gospels in 1783. And so he said that Matthew was the source for Mark, and therefore this is called Matthean priority. And that Luke had both Mark and Matthew as Luke's source. Johann Gottfried Herder believed in oral tradition. And so he was a big proponent of oral tradition, standing behind the written Gospels. And then Wilke and Weisse wrote articles and books, two books and a couple of articles on Markan priority. Ironically, before the great commentator Heinrich August Wilhelm Meyer, the person that put together the Meyer commentary, which are brilliant, his first Meyer commentary on Mark did not believe in Markan priority. But shortly after Wilke and Weisse, he did believe in Markan priority. And then Albert Schweitzer's teacher in Strasbourg was named Heinrich Julius Holtzmann. And he wrote a big, thick book that is called Die Synoptischen Evangelien, ihr Ursprung und geschichtlicher Charakter. The Synoptic Gospels, their origin and their historical character. And so he defended the historical character of Mark, of the three Synoptic Gospels, and he found very believable historical material. And he came up with two big sources. One of them was Marcus. He drew on Heinrich Ewald's work, the book Marcus, A Primitive Mark. So he believed in the source which he gave the letter alpha to, A. And then his other source was the source lambda. And that lambda certainly does seem to be what we call Q. And that was the source of the Matthean and Lucan material that is not in Mark. And so that really was the most important book in German on the Synoptic Gospels. And so that book convinced German-speaking scholarship that Markan priority was correct, and also convinced them of the existence of the synoptic saying source, which we today call Q. He also believed in Marcus, and then later in another smaller book, he wrote a commentary on the Synoptic Gospels as a whole. He dropped the idea of Marcus. But nonetheless, that continues to be an important book. And if you look at the earliest edition of Schweitzer's Quest of the Historical Jesus, it is quite laudatory of his teacher, Holtzmann. Then later in England, at Oxford, there was a fellow named John C. Hawkins who was made a baronet. And so he is Sir John Hawkins. And in his book, he wrote a book that actually exhaustively, and I do mean exhaustively, he actually, he analyzed words. He analyzed Mark's words, Matthew's words, Luke's words, favorite words, words that are avoided. He did a very, very exhaustive and exhausting job of looking at all the literary characteristics of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this book is called Horae Synopticae, Contributions to the Study of the Synoptic Problem, published by Oxford. And it's been reprinted by some people called Leopold, the Leopold Classic Library. You can get a copy of it. And it's a brilliant book, and it gives you all of the agreements and the disagreements of Matthew and Luke with Mark. And so it's a very invaluable book. And then in 1924, there was an Oxford seminar on the Synoptic Gospels. And then one of the people that was a professor, and he was a canon of Christ Church, like me, he was an Anglican priest. And B.H. Streeter brought out his book, The Four Gospels, A Study of Origins, published by Macmillan, and I believe it's never been out of print. And so it argued in favor of Markan priority pretty exhaustively, and also in favor of Q pretty exhaustively. It also had a section on the Gospel of John. And he believed in F.J.A. Hort's theory of local texts. And so he alleged to say, okay, Q came from this place, Mark came from this place, Matthew came from this place. And, you don't have to really agree with that. But it was a great exercise in doing historical criticism. And, that's one of the most brilliant books that any biblical scholar has ever written. Then in 1924, it's been described, Bill Farmer has been described as the angel who came and bothered the waters. In other words, he stirred up the waters. And so in his book, published by Macmillan, I think, Bill Farmer's book was called The Synoptic Problem, A Critical Analysis, in which he gave the history of Markan priority. And then in most of the book, it's a very, very exacting analysis of Markan priority, and it gives you more detail than you can shake many sticks at. And then in the latter part of the book, he gives his theory. And so he thinks that the theory of Markan priority is just dead wrong. And so William Farmer, it's interesting, B.H. Streeter was an Oxford book. And then Bill Farmer, after his book, The Synoptic Problem, was published, Cambridge University gave Bill Farmer an honorary divinity degree. I kid you not. Because it was really brilliantly put together, and there's much to disagree with in the latter part of it. But it's a brilliant book. And then as a seminary student, Bill Farmer had a student named E.P. Sanders. And then later, Ed Sanders went to Union and studied with W.D. Davies, I think, and wrote a book called The Tendencies of the Synoptic Tradition. And that was an exhaustive and exhausting analysis of Markan priority and Matthean priority. And so Ed Sanders, who died not that long ago, probably made a pretty good case that the theories of synoptic origins, at least Ed said that one theory is not extremely better than another, is that you really cannot tell that one theory is a heck of a lot better than the other. to make a long story short. And so Sanders also believed in Markan priority, and then he also did not believe in Q. And so he believed in the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis, where you have Mark first, and then Mark is the source of Matthew, and then Mark and Matthew are the sources of Luke. Like Austin Farrer and like the late Michael Goulder and that bunch. And like Mark Goodacre also. So let's go on to the next. If you believe in Markan priority, then you have to deal with these little problems. And here are the little problems of Markan priority. First of all, the Papias fragments tell us that Matthew was first. And also St. Augustine of Hippo, who was the greatest theologian of the Western Church, wrote a book called De Consensu Evangelistarum, on the agreement of the Gospels. And he basically said that Matthew was first, and Mark was the abbreviator and pedisequus of Matthew. And this pedisequus was a foot follower or a lackey. And so he came up with a theory that Matthew was first, and Mark was the abbreviator and lackey of Matthew. And so the unanimous church tradition, agreeing with the Papias fragments and St. Augustine, was that Matthew was first. You have to decide whether you think that those are persuasive arguments. I do not. But anyway, then there are the minor agreements. And they're in Ed Sanders' book called Studying the Synoptic Gospels. And this is an important book. Graduate students find it very difficult to read. But nonetheless, he gives two examples of Matthew and Luke where there are where Matthew and Luke agree against the Markan text. And we don't really need to go into those disagreements or those agreements against Mark, but they were referred to by Streeter as minor agreements. And so anybody who is in favor of Markan priority has to explain the minor agreements. And one way of explaining the minor agreements is Marcus, an earlier Mark, and therefore Matthew and Luke had an earlier form of Mark than the Mark that we have. That's the beauty of the Marcus theory.
And before you go on, I'll show everybody real quick that the minor agreements in this book, he would put them together like this. Here's some right here.
In Streeter, yeah.
Let me get the camera to focus for a second.
Right.
There we go. Now
and then it's very good. And also in Ed Sanders and Margaret Davies' book, you can see that this is put together like this, first in Greek and then in English. And then he shows you the positive agreements where there are words that are added in Matthew and Luke and not being in Mark. And then there are also negative agreements where there are words of Mark that are left out. So those are positive and negative, quote unquote, minor agreements. So he gives both of those. He gives the first example of the healing of the paralytic in Mark 2, 1-12. And then you have the next one where he doesn't print them out, but he gives you the references in 3 different synopses. So what we do, of course, when we study the Gospels is that we use a synopsis. This is Kurt Aland's synopsis. And then there are other synopses such as the Hook-Graven synopsis. And then the people who believe in Matthean priority have the synopsis by Dom Bernard Orchard. So people who have different theories of the synoptic problem have been known to put together their own synopses. And so the question when you make a synopsis is what is parallel to what? And the layout is certainly different between Kurt Aland's synopsis, which I prefer, and the one that is the one by Albert Hook, revised by Heinrich Graven. And those are the 2 major Greek synopses that we use. Let's go on. And so in favor of Markan priority, and there are several slides like this, let me tell you my position. I believe that much too much is claimed by the people who go gaga over the Papias fragments. Why? We don't really know what Papias refers to as Mark's gospel is really the same as the gospel according to Mark that we have from the manuscripts that we have since the 4th century. So we don't absolutely know what Papias was referring to. And then how do we really know that when Irenaeus quoted Papias, Irenaeus got it right a century later? How do we know that Eusebius got it right in the early 4th century? Eusebius went to the Council of Nicaea. He was present during the lifetime of Constantine, okay? And then when you look at the Papias fragments, aren't we really just repeating hearsay from the 1st century? I think we are. And also, when you start looking carefully, Papias doesn't really refer to a Gospel of Matthew. He refers to Matthew as having written or collected logia, sayings, but he doesn't really claim that that's a gospel in the same way as Mark is a gospel. Also, when you look at Matthew, there is really, in my view, no literary evidence for a Hebrew or Aramaic original of the gospel according to Matthew, despite the many attempts to argue in favor of this. The Shem Tov Matthew, you cannot show that that is a 1st century document. That comes from the Middle Ages. But anyway, it's interesting that Jesus would not have been speaking biblical Hebrew. He would have been speaking Aramaic. And yet Papias seems to not know the difference between Hebrew and Aramaic. On the other hand, the Gospel of the Acts of the Apostles doesn't seem to know that either. So it's hard to get real choicey about Hebrew or Aramaic if we're not really sure of what is really being talked about. Let's go on to the next. If Mark was the abbreviator and lackey of Peter, according to St. Augustine, why would he write a gospel which is so consistently negative about Peter and the other apostles? Why is Peter constantly a schmo? Why does he show Peter denying Jesus 3 times, right? That's an unanswered question. Why would anybody abbreviate Matthew by leaving out the Sermon on the Mount, including the Lord's Prayer, right? Why would anybody abbreviate Matthew by leaving out the presumed fact that the apostles, who are the chief proclaimers of the risen Christ, the apostles are told about the resurrection of Christ by the women at the empty tomb in Matthew and Luke and John. And the women don't say anything to anybody because they're afraid. So there's nothing about the apostles getting the tradition from the women that went to the empty tomb so that they could somehow become the chief proclaimers of the resurrection of Christ. The biggest one of all is, why would anybody abbreviate Matthew by leaving out any narrative of any resurrection appearance of Jesus, given that they're in all the other 3 Gospels? Given the fact, for example, that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul knows all manner of resurrection appearances, and he tells us about 1 Corinthians 15, and he places the risen Christ's appearance to Paul as in 15:8 as one of those resurrection appearances. So if you really are into the Christian faith, why would you leave out resurrection appearances if Matthew and Luke are chronologically prior to Mark? So let's go to the next. Why would anyone take Matthew or Luke's pretty polished Greek style? And why would you change words to create the Gospel of Mark in a more awkward Greek style? If Mark is strongly affected by the genre of a Greek biography, as Richard Burridge has so movingly argued, Why would anybody abbreviate Matthew and Luke by leaving out everything about Jesus' parentage and development as a child? That's not what Greek biographies do. And so if, as has often been claimed, that Mark is a biography or primarily a biography, if Matthew and Luke had the material about, Jesus' origin, what it was like with Mary and Joseph, et cetera, why would that be left out if Matthew or Luke were first? Also, Mark was very interested, as Wolfgang Roth has shown in this book, Hebrew Gospel, Cracking the Code of Mark. Here's the book. Wolfgang was one of my teachers. He was a brilliant Old Testament scholar. And he spent a year in Jerusalem and learned about Jewish storytelling, and he came back and wrote this book. But given the fact that you have the Elijah and Elisha cycle of deeds of power in 2 Kings 2 through 13, where you have Elijah does 8 miracles, Elisha does 16 miracles, and then in Mark, after Jesus does 16 miracles, in Mark 7:37, the people say he has done all things well. And then in Mark, Jesus does 8 more deeds of power. So the Elijah-Elisha cycle of stories certainly seems to be very important, including the analogy of John the Baptist to Elijah and the increased number of miracles that Elisha did, the analogy to Jesus. And if that is true, why would Mark leave out the characteristic Matthean quotation formula, which is peculiar to Matthew? These things happened in order to fulfill the words of the prophet blank, saying blank. See, that's Matthew's famous quotation formula. If Mark was so interested in Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecy or analogy of doing deeds of power like Elijah and Elisha, why would Mark leave out the Matthean quotation formula? Okay, next. So, in historical criticism of the Bible, or in historical analysis of any document from the ancient world, whether it's the Bible or whether it's a church father or whether it's a rabbi, we do not really get to claim certainty very often. Now, personally, I am certain that Paul did not write Hebrews, and I think you can be certain about that one. I'm certain about the fact that the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. That's a very hard piece of evidence. But most of the time in biblical studies, we don't get to claim certainty. And so the best we can do is to make the case that our position, whatever it is, accords with the most important evidence or the majority of evidence. And we have to be satisfied with that, given that we are separated from Jesus by 2,000 years of history, 2,000 years of cultural differences, including the differences in language. And so, like most New Testament scholars, I believe that Markan priority accords with most of the evidence when that evidence is clear. And when we're dealing with the Papias fragments, I ain't too sure that's clear. Okay. And I don't think there is another slide, is there? No, that's it.
Oh,
Something
I
happened
was
to our
muted.
sound.
I was muted. Okay, so I just realized that. Can you hear me?
Hello? I can't
Hello?
hear you. I
Can
can't
you
hear
hear me?
anything.
All right, let me unmute me. Can you hear me now? Frank, can you hear me? Well, this is strange. me try this. Can you hear me, Frank?
Maybe you can hear me, but I can't hear anything at all.
You still can't hear me? All right.
Let me unmute. Hello?
Hello?
Okay, I'll leave and I'll rejoin. Sorry about that. I don't understand this.
It's fine. Let's just wait for Frank to come back. By the way, if anyone wants to ask questions, please super chat. I will only take super chat questions.
Hello?
All right, Frank, can you hear me now?
I can't hear you. I can't hear anything. Let's try this.
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear it this?
I've been hearing you.
Can you hear this?
Yes.
I'm not hearing anything.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and close it.
And then I can unmute.
This is no idea what the problem is.
Sorry about that. I've just completely lost the sound.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.